Good morning. I appreciate each of you for being here this morning. And if you knew I was the one speaking and decided to show up anyways, I appreciate you even more. You all encourage me. So I was not here last week for the introduction of the John series, so I have no idea what was said. And when I finally thought, hey, maybe I should watch that, I had entirely too much else to do. So didn't get to it, but today we're going to be taking a look at two stories in the Gospel of John. And from the very beginning of John, it kind of sets us up for these two stories. We have John's introduction, which is Jesus came into the world. He was the light that, gave life to all mankind. And then, we go through that entire introduction in chapter 1, and then we have chapter 2, which has the wedding in Cana and the clearing of the temple. And by the time we get through these two stories, we kind of get the idea. We get a picture that the Jews in this time had no idea of. Something is happening that the Jews of this time had no idea. They've been told all these prophecies, but it's all happening so differently than what they expected. Things are changing, and nobody recognizes it. And that sets us up for the next two stories. We see Nicodemus, and we see the Samaritan woman at the well. And I'm not going to go too deep into, the theological points or whatever of this story. Today we're going to do just a character study of these two characters. So first we have Nicodemus. Nicodemus is described as a leader of the Jews. Jesus, calls him a teacher of Israel. And he's a guy with clout. He's in this time period, we have, if you're familiar with honor-shame, if you will, societies, it kind of creates a hierarchy, and Nicodemus is close to the top. Everybody knows him, everybody respects him. This is Nicodemus. So he goes to Jesus under the cover of darkness. Why does he go under the cover of darkness? It's because he doesn't want anybody else to know he's there. He may have come with a small group of people. We kind of get an indication of that, but Nicodemus is the one who's named. And he knows something is up with Jesus. He comes to him and he says, Jesus, we know you're from God. Nobody can do these things unless you're from God. But he still has questions, because everything he's been told as a Pharisee, as somebody who's waited his entire life for this Messiah, this picture that the Jews had up to this point, it just doesn't line up. So he has this conversation with Jesus, and we see a light kind of start to come on a little bit. But the picture we get is Nicodemus. He's just so high up there, and there's just so much for him to lose if he decides to let go of it all and follow Jesus. And we see him a little bit later in the Gospel of John. He's mentioned two more times. One of them was at the trial of Jesus, the kind of kangaroo court that the Jews did before they took him to Pilate. And the second time, let me back up. During that time, during that, fake trial, Nicodemus is the one who speaks up, and he's like, guys, are we going too far with this? Does he really need to be crucified? And everybody else was kind of like, did you hear something? Shut up, Nicodemus. And then we see him, after Jesus is crucified, after he's been killed, he helps Joseph of Arimathea prepare Jesus' body for burial. And Joseph of Arimathea is described as a secret disciple of Christ. Those words are not used for Nicodemus, but you kind of get that same vibe. That he believes in Christ, he knows who he is, but there's, just the way he's been living his life Jesus just doesn't quite fit that mold. And so he has to keep it kind of on the down low. The Samaritan woman is a very different character. We learn a little bit about her, not a whole lot about her lives, but enough to know that she's lived a pretty rough life. She's had 5 husbands and is living in the house of a 6th man who's not her husband. And whatever reason those marriages ended, whether she was divorced, whether her husbands died, whether it was, her own immorality is the story that's told a lot of times. Whatever it is, 5 marriages and a 6th household, that's a lot. No matter how old you are, that's a rough life. And she goes out, we know she goes out to the well and she wants to get a drink, get water for her house, whatever she's doing out there. And she runs into Jesus. And Jesus starts up a conversation with her, and she says, "I'm a Samaritan woman. Why are you even talking to me? Much less asking me for a drink of water." And Jesus kind of, if you knew who I was, you'd be asking me for the water of life. So she, asks about this water, and the conversation continues. I just untied my shoe. That's annoying. Stepped on my shoelace. The conversation continues, and Jesus kind of goes, "Let me introduce you to yourself." So he tells her everything she's ever done. Her words, not mine. And, he tells her about these husbands that she's had and this household that she's living in. And something kind of goes off in her head. She says, I can see that you're a prophet. Let me ask you a couple questions. And Jesus answers these questions in the way, Jesus would. It kind of doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, but it's the right answer. And she goes, "Well, when the Messiah gets here, he'll make everything clear for us." And Jesus goes, as far as we know, she is the first person that Jesus outright told, "Hey, I'm the Messiah." And what does she do? She immediately goes into town and she tells everybody she can find. She wants everybody to know. She became the first person to spread the news of Jesus. So when I see in the Bible 2 characters kind of side by side, I like to take a look at both of those. Or it doesn't even have to be characters. It can be just, in Proverbs it mentions wise people do this, foolish people do this. When I see that, I like to look at me and I say, do I do this or do I do this? Am I wise or am I foolish? Do I look more like Nicodemus or do I look more like the Samaritan woman at the well? And I don't answer that question quickly, because the more I think about it, and the Venn diagram that happens in my head, the good traits, I see a few, and then the not good traits, there's a list. It doesn't look good for me when I start looking at myself like that. So, looking at myself through these 2 stories, I look at Nicodemus and I look at myself. I was raised to be pretty religious. I'll tell you the family I was raised in. My grandfather, when he was 19 years old, just less than a month before he turned 20, was married August 14th, 1955, Sunday morning, 6 a.m. He married my grandmother, drove from Oklahoma to Montana, and started his first preaching job. He preached 64 years and 2 months. He preached his last sermon as a employed preacher in October of 2019 before his death in January of 2020. He preached himself exhausted. When he finally had no more energy, that's when he finally decided to quit preaching. And he was it was hard to look at him, but he was still preaching. He spent the last few years of his life sitting in a recliner with his head rested on his hand like that. Could not stand up straight. There's a picture of him at Sarah and my wedding. And his head is kind of like this. He's standing up as straight as he possibly can. But he was still preaching the word every Sunday. I was raised by that man's son. Now, quite a difference between my grandpa and my dad, but I was still raised in that family. So I was raised to be pretty faithful to the word. But the more I look at it, if Jesus was here today, if he was, if he had a YouTube channel and he was making videos on YouTube, or if he was going and doing street preaching, visiting hospitals and performing miracles, would what he said line up with what I believed? Would the miracles that he did in the hospital, would I believe that they even happened? I'm not sure that for most of my life, I would have been able to recognize Jesus if he was here today. Finally, in the last few years of my life, I've started slowing down a little bit, ignoring society and paying more attention to my Bible. And I think today I probably would. Before I got married, absolutely not. But then I look at the Samaritan woman, and I look at her life, and she lived a pretty broken life. I lived a pretty broken life too. When I tell you that I was homeless when I graduated high school, that's not an exaggeration. My family broke up right around that time, and it was horrible. But Jesus came to this Samaritan woman, and he took something that was broken and he turned it into something that immediately went out and told everybody about him. Just in one conversation. Nicodemus went to Jesus. The difference there is Jesus went to the Samaritan woman. Nicodemus went to Jesus. And Nicodemus still didn't quite get it. He didn't make room for Jesus in his life. And I see a little bit of both in myself. So my purpose is to get you to kind of reflect on your lives, to get you to think about all these things. Think about what Jesus said, and then think about this church. Think about, your political party or your job or the people you interact with, your family, whatever it is. And know the difference between what Jesus said and what they say. Because sometimes it gets way too muddled and we don't even realize that there's a difference. John chapter 3, verses 19 through 21 says, "And this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and people love the darkness rather than the light, because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light, so that their deeds may not be exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light, so that it may be clearly seen, their deeds have been done in God." Nicodemus came to Jesus at night. Jesus came to the Samaritan woman right in the middle of the day. There's darkness and there's light. And we know that Nicodemus, he got there eventually. His hopes and dreams were probably crushed when Jesus was crucified. And then when Jesus resurrected, we don't hear what happened to Nicodemus. And that happens a lot. in Scripture, we don't necessarily get the conclusion of what a lot of these characters did. The one that comes to my mind is the rich young ruler. Jesus gave him options, and all we know is that he went away sad. We don't know what he did with that. Nicodemus is the same way. We don't know what he did after Jesus' resurrection. But we know that he got it. The church today, the Church of Christ, whoever professes to be a Christian in the West, I think they get it. But I don't think it always lines up for them. So if that's you, and I'm not pointing fingers at anybody. I don't mean to do that to anybody, because I already admitted that it was me. But if that's you, we have a congregation here of people who listen to Jesus, of people who know how to point you in the right way. We have people here who are willing to pray for you. We have water behind me if you want to be baptized today. Just whatever you need. Let a friend know, let an elder know. Come forward now as we stand and sing.